Good afternoon, and welcome to the Faculty Forum Online, a program of the MIT Alumni Association. I'm Judy Cole, and I'm the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Alumni Association, and I will serve as your moderator today. Any alumni who would like to ask a question, please enter your first name and location and the question in the form on your screen. We will try to get to as many as we can today. Our guest today is Professor Markus Buehler, head of MIT Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Professor Buehler is celebrating his 10th year at MIT this fall and his third as Course 1 department head. From 2011 to 2013, he served as director of MIT's Computation Design and Optimization program. Since 2010, he has also served as director of the MIT Germany program, part of MISTI, the MIT International Science and Technology Initiatives. Professor Buehler, thanks for joining us. Could you start by giving us an overview of your department and describe how it has changed in the last decade?
Yeah, thank you very much, Judy, and welcome. Thank you for tuning in. It's great to be here. I'll start off by giving a few slides on the kind of things we're doing in the department these days, and I'll sort of kick off the discussion today. Here's also my contact information if you like to get in touch with me with Twitter, LinkedIn, email. I'm very happy to engage with you in discussions after this presentation today as well. So CE has really changed quite a bit in the last decade or so, and I'll give a few highlights in the kind of priorities and vision that we have at this point. CE has the effects of the department have really tangible, visible results in many ways. You can see we're really concerned about understanding the sources of strength of materials and structures and systems. We're very concerned about the small-scale changes and big impacts, and I'll talk about this a little more today. So we really are interested in connecting scales from very tiny molecules or little microbes to the global scale of the planet. We're also interested in global systems, so a lot of the things we do are really large in scale, both in physical scale but also in impact. We deal with massive data, and you can imagine once civil environmental engineers deal with environmental systems or infrastructure systems, there's a lot of data out there that we can use to make decisions. We also are really engineering the world at a very large scale. We're dealing with cities and other global systems that are growing around the world today. We're concerned about speed, and so this is an example for transportation. We're worried about how to move people and goods and logistics around in the world. We also, of course, want to be smart about the decisions we make in moving things around, so we're really concerned about the path we take, the choices in actually directing transportation logistics, but also in directing the path for humanity and the planet moving forward. We're concerned with resources. Our department is very interested in understanding how we extract resources from the planet in a sustainable way, and that goes from anything from traditionally mining or oil, petroleum resources, but also in resources like food and clean water, clean air that we need to enable civilization. And of course, many of these systems, living systems on this planet, provide us actually with these resources like clean air and food and agricultural systems. And so we're worried about how these very complex naturally existing systems interact with the human-built environment that we need to survive as civilization. And as we experience really changes in this planet's composition, we also need to understand these changes, because as you can see, the blooming flower on the previous slide can change quite quickly into a very different environment as climate changes on a regional or global scale, as we deplete resources, and so we need to understand how to prevent these things from happening or to deal with them, mitigate them in different ways. Human systems, so this picture here shows the kinds of things that civil engineers built. We build roads, we build roads that connect cities, that enable cities to work and function, and you can see sort of the multiple scales here, from the individual driver in the vehicle to the traffic jam to the connectivity of these systems really in a very large scale. And as you can see here, a lot of the changes happening today are happening in countries that are developing very rapidly, and so we're very concerned about civilization on any different place on the planet. And so understanding rapidly changing cities in countries like China, India, South America are very much a concern for us. And ultimately, it's about human lives. So civil engineers and environmental engineers really enable civilization and ultimately affect human lives at a very fundamental scales. So how people live, what conditions they live in. So here, this picture really shows of dramatic living conditions. And we need to understand how growing populations on this planet can be managed and dealt with, and how we can provide housing and transportation and food and clean water and clean air for various kind of populations, which ultimately lead us to this theme that we have in the department is big engineering. So civil environmental engineering really is, we refer to as big engineering, is we engineer the world at a very large scale from its fundamental building blocks of the individual people, the individual microbes, the individual plants that actually allow us to live and pursue civilization. So big engineering has been a theme that the department has embraced for the last couple of years, and we have developed these positioning of MIT CEE in this particular way here. We combine, quite uniquely I think at MIT, 4 anchors. And one is the science. So we have a very strong interest in fundamentals faculty in the sciences. Rooted in the sciences, the fundamental understanding of systems, be it natural systems or synthetic infrastructure systems. We have a very strong focus on engineering, and if we'll get to that in our discussion today, our students and faculty like to solve real problems and actually make a difference in the world, here in the US and anywhere really around the globe. And we also focus on 2 particular domains, and that's the infrastructure. We call infrastructure is essentially everything that humans build and make. Synthetic things that we have created as humans. And the environment on the other sort of side of the coin, which are all the natural systems. These are the things that naturally exist, and this includes plants and the oceans, microbes, and they're very closely coupled. So this department really is a place where we do both. We do the science to understand, the engineering to solve, and the infrastructure environment provide the anchors in the domains of what we do. And all these sort of 4 pieces form the puzzle that we call civil environmental engineering at MIT, and we frame it in this context of big engineering, which refers to our aspiration to solve the world's grand challenges through the creation of very large-scale systems that have sustainable impact on and significant impact, visible impact on people and sustainability. So the people and the people's living conditions and ability to move, to transport, to travel, to be healthy is really at the core of what we do ultimately. We do this by creating these very large-scale systems. So that gives you a little introduction into the kinds of things we do, and so I hope it'll stimulate some further questions today.
That's terrific, Markus. Thank you. It sounds like civil engineering sort of does everything. It covers the whole globe. Questions are starting to come in from the live audience, but first allow me to ask 1 or 2 of my own. So first, your research on spider silk was highlighted in the MIT News website last week. What applications might this research have on the growing field of 3D printing?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. My research lab deals with how to make better materials, and better in a sense, they're more durable, they're lighter, stronger. And as we know, when we drive on the roads and bridges here in this country, many of those are breaking apart, unfortunately. And so we're very concerned about creating materials that last longer and that are stronger. And when bridges collapse or the roads sort of develop cracks, it's really a breakdown of materials. And so the work we do in my lab is concerned with finding ways of creating better materials from less. So materials that have more functionality, that can last longer in many different conditions, and environmental conditions that are quite extreme. So if you think about infrastructure, it's exposed to multiple seasons, high temperature, low temperature, salt leads to corrosion. And so we're pursuing this paradigm in the lab that really merges what we call structure and material in the design. So we begin to engineer chemical structures to really to understand how we use building blocks from different sources. So traditionally you would mine for materials, but we're thinking about growing materials from resources like algae or waste products. But now we have to find a way of converting these chemical compounds that we have available into functional materials, and that's very hard. Traditionally, what it takes is a lot of energy and a lot of very specific resources, which limits the way by which we can create materials. So my lab is interested in finding alternative sources, and so that's how we came to spider silk. Spider silk is one of the strongest materials that we know in nature. So it's actually stronger than steel, and it is made essentially at room temperature. So without a steel plant, without high temperature, without processing, from proteins. So what the spider does, the spider eats prey, which it catches in this web, which you can see here, and it transforms these very, very simple proteins into very strong materials that are very durable. And so this is something that we're trying to understand and actually replicate in the lab. And so we went through many different stages in this research. So this picture here is one where we look at three-dimensional structures. So you've seen in the previous slide two-dimensional web, which we all know. These here are three-dimensional webs, and this is something we're exploring at this point. These are very complex architectural and structural designs, so there's a lot of interesting insights here to learn for structural engineering, so what civil engineers and architects actually use to create buildings and structures, bridges. So we're hoping to extract principles from these.
Do all spiders do those three-dimensional webs, or is it a particular
It's particular
species?
types, yeah. So certain spiders make two-dimensional webs, certain spiders make three-dimensional webs, and historically, most engineers, scientists, biologists have studied two-dimensional webs. Only recently, we've really began to quantify three-dimensional webs. They're very complicated. So one of the things we've done here is we've created a new measuring device that uses lasers to actually image, to quantify how these three-dimensional webs look like. And so in this picture here, you can see how the laser sort of slices the web into two-dimensional thin slices, which we can then image and bring right straight into a computer simulation, and ultimately understand the composition of spider silk. So what you have here on the slide is really how the individual molecules connect to the web. You can see there are multiple hierarchies of scale, and these form very complex interactions, which is what we develop theories for. And ultimately, once we have done this, we can 3D print them. And so this is what the story was about. We can actually now replicate the natural process by which spiders make silk and mimic them in the laboratory. So really starting from the genetic scale of the proteins, engineering the genes that make the proteins, and then ultimately print these webs. And so this is one of the pictures here that has a three-dimensional 3D printed web that we've made essentially from these sort of understanding that we've developed in the lab.
Wow, that's incredible. It's really incredible. So another question I have is, can you talk about some of your priorities for new labs and facilities in the department?
Yeah. So this is an interesting interesting question. The department is we're very lucky. We're in building 1, which is, you recall, is one of the main group. But it's also one of the oldest buildings, and so we're indeed really prioritizing right now renovating laboratories and providing new facilities. So we've gone through a couple of renovations in the spring. We're doing one right now, and we're planning for more in the future. So in the building 1 is the Pierce Laboratory, which is the civil infrastructure area of the department. The other one is Parsons. So for those of you who are in Parsons, building 48 is the environmental science laboratory. In Pierce, we're really looking at laboratories for infrastructure, materials, structures, systems. We're interested in building a new energy lab, really trying to understand how we can extract resources from various sources. There's a lot of interest in these new durable materials at very large scales we talked about. So if we can find new infrastructure materials that have sensors built in, can we place them on bridges to make them smart? The transportation laboratories. So it's really in the areas of infrastructure that we're prioritizing for new laboratories. And the good news is we have some great new faculty hires we've done the last several years, and so those are growing now in research volume and research labs, and so there's some really exciting community forming in the department right now.
That's terrific. So I ought to turn to the alumni questions here. Robert in Washington asks, does CEE have any current program for assisting with solutions to help improve the infrastructure and lives of people in developing countries, in Africa or the Caribbean?
Interesting question, yeah. There are many students. MIT has, as you know, a couple of programs like the D-Lab in which students can engage in work abroad. So there's definitely an opportunity there. And we usually have a couple of students each year that do that kind of work. And we had a student recently who actually won one of the awards in the department for constructions. Yeah, he worked on building bridges in Malawi, exactly along the lines of what the alumni asked. So there are oftentimes places in the world where we have rapid development, are actually very exciting opportunities for the department, for the students and the faculty to engage, because in the US, the motion is very slow in infrastructure, unfortunately. I mean, we also have most of the bridges, even though they're collapsing. But in places in the world where, like in Brazil or in Africa or China, it's a huge and rapid development. And actually, we have opportunity to make decisions today about designs which the students like to interact with. Many faculty have projects in those places. And they involve usually undergraduate and graduate students. So there's a project, for example, in Rio de Janeiro. One of the faculty works in transportation. She is designing a new transportation system for their facilities for the upcoming Olympics. And there's work going on in Riyadh along similar lines, where countries are developing new rapid transportation systems basically from scratch. And our faculty and students are involved in designing those. Essentially using what we know today about our own transportation systems and how they work or don't work, and trying to really design from scratch. So it's an exciting opportunity.
I was going to say, that must be very exciting, yes, to have a blank slate and be able to do it right.
Exactly, yeah.
Instead of having to tweak something that's already in place.
That's right, yeah. So there are many opportunities, and the students and faculty and the staff involved are very excited about these. So it's a great opportunity. I mean, we call it what we do usually is really global in reach, and of course, we thrive on this challenge of bringing the kinds of insights we have here at CMIT into the world out there.
So another alumnus asks, Philip in California, your website says, quote, the development of new materials may lead to better designs and could replace classical designs, unquote. Please give some examples of successful commercial implementations in civil engineering that came from your research.
Well, materials are really an integral part in design. So I think the question really refers to architectural design, right, and how, say, a bridge or a building is built. A lot of times, as an architect, you would pick existing materials from a library, say this type of concrete or this type of steel or glass. So the vision we have is that we can merge the two. So an architect could actually, designer could actually come up with a design and then ask for a material that would satisfy the requirements for this design. So this is what we're working towards. And the applications in our work that we talked about 3D printing a little bit earlier today. So 3D printing actually allows us to create composite materials with almost limitless possibilities and property combinations. So we can make materials very soft, very stiff. We can make them resilient. We can make them fracture resistant. We can make them have certain optical properties, and there's a long way to go to scale it up. But so the incipient seeds are there to actually do this. And so if you imagine in a future, you wouldn't pick from a static library of materials, but you would actually be able to create the material as you develop the design. So that's the vision we have from our lab for the future of civil engineering structures.
Sort of basically saying, these are the characteristics that I need. Right. Give me the material that will meet these specs.
Exactly. And so in the future, I mean, this is really further down the road probably, but if you imagine then having a manufacturing technique like 3D printing or its variations, probably not the one we have today, it's going to be a little more complicated, but the idea is that we can actually 3D print those structures essentially directly from your computer. So we've done this in small systems, like I've showed you the spider web. It's sort of a toy problem that we use in academics, but you can imagine these are actually, the spider webs are essentially created in the computer and then printed with a mouse click. And so imagine if you're an architect who can design a structure, and we can do the civil analysis of the strengths and so forth, the forces, and then actually create this essentially with 3D manufacturing on the spot. So this would be the long-term plan and really an exciting opportunity for new designs.
Fascinating. It won't come fast enough for our bridges, though, I'm afraid.
I'm afraid too, yeah. But we can fix them. So a lot of times when we do work on materials, it's less visionary, aspirational. It's very concrete. So we have projects involved in projects with
pun intended. It's
yeah,
very
exactly.
concrete.
well, we actually figure out ways of fixing concrete, and so for example, by creating new composites out of epoxy and carbon to wrap around concrete that's breaking down. And so this is work we're doing. Part of this is funded by the National Science Foundation, part of it's funded by Kuwait, a project with the MIT Kuwait Center on resilient infrastructure. And so those are more concrete kind of examples of what we do, which are less visionary, but they're really important actually, and exactly as you say, addressing these questions when infrastructure actually breaks down.
So Ted in Phoenix asks, why do we select our MIT students on their knowledge of STEM processes and facts when the most critical success factors are their innate talents of divergent thinking, quantitative reasoning, and problem formation?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. This, I think, when we get the students come to the department and as sophomores, we actually do pay a lot of attention to those skills outside of STEM. We have we have a lot of work going on in the department in teaching where we're dealing really with group work, teamwork. The students are exposed to real-world settings where they have to have a very complicated problem that does not have a single answer. In fact, there are multiple answers. They have to formulate the problem to address these issues. So I have we'll go to this couple of pictures here. So typically, students are exposed to these undergraduate research projects, like many other departments. But this is a way of actually teaching those types of skills, where problem is so complicated, there's no single answer. And the students will learn how to formulate the problem, the question, and they typically also quickly realize that the answer is not found by themselves. In fact, found in groups, and so they work with in the labs, in the project-based kind of environments with other students, with faculty. So here you see one of our faculty, Professor John Oxendorf, on the top, working with a bunch of students on a structural problem. We also have a lot of interest in field work. So this here is a picture from a student group. We have a required subject in the environmental track in our program, where students spend a month in Hawaii, typically in Hawaii, during January.
All over.
Yeah, it's terrible location, of course, to go to in January, but it's a great place because it allows all the international students to go to a place with many different ecological systems. Hawaii is a very interesting environmental place. And so the students go in a group. They design a real field experiment, so they build it up from scratch in the typical MIT way. So they rent a truck, a van, and they build their own equipment. They go to Home Depot and build, and design what they're going to do. They design the measurement campaign. Oftentimes they work with volcanoes there, so we have different themes each year. This is last year we had a theme on air quality, volcanoes, soil sampling. So it touches all the areas of civil environmental engineering, from the soils to the air quality, to chemistry, to sort of the geological rocks and so forth. And this is exciting because really allows the students to be again in a real world setting, and they take the analytical skills that they learn and they have sort of innate, and this is very important, we admit them with those skills, but they learn much more during the time when they're in the department, and they also learn the prototype. So this is an example of, again, the typical MIT way that we want the students to be able to essentially solve problems with a piece of paper and a little bit of glue or paper clips here. And so figuring out a structural design problem with very primitive tools is kind of like what I think MIT graduates all over the world are known for, that they can take the back of the envelope or take the envelope itself and solve a very complex problem and illustrate principles that guide solutions. And so this is something we foster very, very significantly in the department in many different ways.
So our next question connects to, I think maybe connects to the Hawaii month that you just mentioned. Bill in Hagerstown, Maryland asks, is CEE addressing rising ocean levels and its effects on low-lying, heavily populated lands such as Florida?
Yeah. So the effects of climate change are definitely of great interest to the department in many different ways. I want to say there's one particular sort of aspect of the of climate change or changing conditions that we're concerned with, and that is the regional effect. So when you talk to climate scientists, usually they think about the global scale and rising sea levels, and the department really is interested in developing predictions on a local scale, very specific ones. And so you mentioned an example of Florida. I don't have any specific example of anyone working in that area. There could be, but in general, it's exactly along the lines of what we're concerned with. So we like to make predictions on a local regional scales. I have one example here I can pull up here, and that is how the effects of changes in climate will affect crop yields. This is work by Professor Colette Heald, who just received tenure, actually a few weeks ago. It's just announced. And so she's one of our star faculty in the department working on predicting how climate change on a regional scale, and so you see this broken down by US, Europe, Asia, different areas in the world, how the yield of different crops, these are the main sort of nutrients in the world, wheat, rice, maize, and soybean, how they're going to change as climate changes. And specifically, not just the rising temperature of sea levels, but actually changes in the composition of the atmosphere. So it's a very complex system. So these are predictions that are real engineering predictions for a local regional government to decide whether it makes sense to shift the production from rice to maize or soybean to wheat. And so in a similar way, the department is naturally very interested in, say, predictions like in the example of Florida. Years ago, we had a project with Venice, and this is something that you might have heard about, the floodgates that they built in Venice. A lot of the faculty in the department were quite involved in this as well. The Moses, I think it was called the Moses project. This is something that potentially, if this were to come up, could actually be applied in a case like Florida, even though it's a much larger scale. So I'm not sure how easy it would be, but the department is definitely interested in those areas, and so we hope to get questions. By the way, I mean, these are the kinds of things where we really like to get involved with our alumni and invite you to events and so forth that we have, and email with me, of course, and get in touch, because a lot of these real-world problems are great illustrations and motivations for new research projects or new student projects. So I'd be happy to talk more about this.
Excellent, thank you. So I always feel obligated to go back to the alumni questions here, so they don't always flow in a logical pattern. But Bashar in Istanbul asks, the main materials civil engineers use are steel and cement. Both require high energy input to produce. When are we going to get sustainable materials at large quantities and low costs?
Yeah, that's a really a question that, as you alluded to, refers back to the research we do in my lab,
right.
Very much. So this really drives the spider silk. Yeah, this really drives a lot of the passion I have for the work we do, in that we really see that we're sort of approached a limit in what we can do with the existing materials. So concrete is an example where it produces about 5 to 10% of the world's global CO2 emission. It requires huge amounts of energy to produce. It's a lot of heating and grinding involved. Steel is the same idea. When you produce steel, you need a steel mill and heat it up. So there's a significant cost in energy. It's also very hard to find these resources. And if you imagine, we can do calculations in the kind of consumptions we'll have with these materials if the population grows to 10, 20 billion people in the world, we actually might not be able to sustain this. So we always talk about food supply, but there's also a cost or supply or need for these materials you mentioned, steel and concrete. So they're very interested in really looking at these materials from a fundamental level, and the key really is in the chemistry. So I have a picture here of some of the work we do in the department in looking at concrete, which is, in fact, this is probably the oldest engineering material, oldest civil engineering material, thousands of years old. And we make it today essentially the way the Romans made it. And their structures are still, some of them are still standing today. But of course, it comes at a huge cost. We just put a lot of energy, a lot of material, raw material in there. So what we're doing in the department, we're trying to re-engineer this material using nanotechnology, which is something that's become available, of course, in the last couple of decades. And so by understanding concrete, for example, at molecular scale, understanding how concrete derives its function, it has certain very attractive properties. It's liquid, right? It flows, it hardens, and it actually lasts for quite a while. So the kind of questions we're dealing with is, can we replace concrete with something completely different? Say something that actually is derived from plants, or from waste, something that has a negative CO2 balance. And a lot of these things are today sort of science fiction or vision in the future, but if you imagine, but we have shown, for example, with work on silk we've been doing, so the idea of using silk or something like silk is not to use actual silk to replace concrete. That's not what we're trying to do, but understanding the principles of how silk becomes as strong as steel, and then making something with very different properties, very different raw materials. We're not going to use spiders to build buildings, at least not in the near future. But we can use the principles, right? And the very attractive, interesting challenge in civil environmental engineering is always the scalability, so the big scale, because we can make almost any material we want at very small scales. We can spend enough money and we can make a nanogram of something. But the kind of challenges we're interested in are how do we scale it up to the scale of a city or the globe? That's, again, we refer to this theme as big engineering. I mean, we're interested in big scales. And so finding a material that can replace concrete will require us to be scalable. So we can make enough of that material at a reasonable cost and low energy and maybe negative carbon balance that can actually supply all the construction facilities we need in the world. So those are exciting intellectual challenges.
So here's a wonderful question. I just love this about the local scale. Sheza in New York asks, in your opinion, does Boston have the infrastructure to support the 2024 Olympics?
Oh, not yet. I think this is a great question. Also relates to education. So education has been something that when I started, you mentioned I started 2 years ago, we really we put a lot of emphasis on education. And one of the things we've done actually is to make the sort of sophomore classes more accessible, more interesting. And one of the classes we teach is 101. So those of you who took 101 is the Introduction to Civil Environmental Engineering Design. And it will actually involve, in the fall this year, the Olympics. And so the students will, the sophomores who join the department, will actually work on designing the infrastructure for the Olympics. So we're taking this head on. But I think we'll learn more about what they find. But yes, it's not ready today. Yeah. So we'll take a lot of investment potentially.
I think all of us who live here know that.
Doesn't even support the current population.
Right.
Yeah.
Bob in Boston says, please describe CEE's commitment to R&D of groundwater resource management, protection and restoration. Groundwater is in many ways a poor cousin to surface water, yet groundwater supports surface water flows and it constitutes a much larger reservoir of fresh water globally.
Yeah, great question. Yeah. I refer to the Parsons Laboratory, who that has a long history in that area, and there are very important challenges in environmental context, really, in how resources, and including water and very deep groundwater, flows on this planet. And understanding these flows really involves chemistry, very long time scale processes. So we hired faculty this past year, Professor Kolkar, and his interest is actually in monitoring how natural materials like sand and soils and grains interact with flows of water, for example, and how they change. And so what he does, he basically understands how in very deep environments, how groundwater flows and how it is affected by the natural environment of certain rocks and geological formations. And so there's some very fundamental science going on in the department in those directions, as well as very practical aspects as well in understanding how the effect of fracking, for example, hydrofracking, is affected by this. So there's a group in the department that is very concerned with these kinds of questions.
Terrific. Ivan in Los Angeles asks, I believe that the major problem that underlies our problems is the continuing growth of the human population. Can you describe what your department is doing on this matter? Clearly, the population of the planet must stabilize and perhaps decrease.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. In fact, the population growth is as I alluded to a little bit earlier, is in fact one of the major drivers that actually creates challenges and opportunities for us, because the growth, the way it works right now, is not going to be scalable to support 10, 20 plus billion people on this planet. So this is really at the heart of the question. I think the planet could probably support more people than right now, but we'll have to change the way we use the energy and how we create things. So when we build the infrastructure for the world, if we make it out of concrete and steel, it won't be possible. But if we find other sources, and if we find other sources for energy and clean water and clean air, and if we understand the principles or the mechanisms that actually provide these resources, for example, clean air and clean water, then we can make it work. But it's exactly at the heart of the problem that the department has. So this is really, I think, a theme that the department has. And in the we have a set of 5 large themes, strategic thrusts in the department, and I'll pull it up right now here. That goes from the left, ecology, which really is understanding the natural systems that live in the oceans. And these systems not only form oceans that are nice to look at, but actually they provide the basis for clean water and clean air, because these microorganisms that live in there in huge amounts are critical for carbon cycling. So they control climate, which in turn controls the resources. And we think about resources as alluded to: clean water, air, food, energy, raw materials. The question of coastal resilience, because the coast in many ways is a resource for humanity, right? Many cities are built on coasts for good reasons. They provide easy access to transportation, provide access to water, but the resilience of these systems is being threatened by various factors, including the population increase, right, as well as climate change and other questions. So they're sort of, because resources and structures, and so we're interested in understanding how all the infrastructure and the structures we built, and that goes from the roads to the materials we use to build them, to the infrastructure for energy. Right? So if you imagine, we're not inventing the solar panels, but we invent where to put them, and how to connect them, and how to make them safe, and how to put them up there so they're going to last for decades to come. So those are the kinds of questions civil engineers would look at. To cities, and so the cities are really the places where a lot of the action is happening right now. Population growth really happens in cities, and in many ways in an uncontrolled way. So the question speaks to this. In the US, the growth, of course, is modest, but in many other places in the world, the growth is really exponential. And even though we have some opportunities to work with certain cities to design their systems, but there just is an enormous amount of random self-organized processes going on that are potentially quite threatening. And I have in the cities aspect, we sometimes talk about public health as well, because as you imagine putting, and that goes both for the population increase in the planet, but also in cities, as you put more and more people in closed environments, you can find them in the housing. So I showed this large picture with the houses. The way diseases spread in these kinds of infrastructure, in these kinds of confined environments, is very different than if you live in rural settings. So we could see very different challenges also in public health, understanding how these systems really, and this quickly goes to global scales, right? So we're looking at, of course, the global scale here, global systems, really imagining the exact question the caller, the alumni asked about, is how urbanization and population growth of sort of one of the challenges, 10 billion, but it could be beyond that down the road. How do we deal with this? How do we deal with climate change, global health? So disease outbreaks, and we've seen this with Ebola.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that.
Actually, and we understand surprisingly little about how these diseases actually spread at a mechanistic level. So if you now say, you think about as somebody sneezing in a subway, and there's a new type of disease that's being spread. There are some really interesting challenges in designing infrastructure, including subways, transportation systems, airplanes, in a way that we mitigate these effects, right? And so the actual mechanism by which these particles, so if you sneeze in the subway, so there's a picture here shows a person sitting in the front here, he has no idea what's going on. And of course, these kind of particles that spread during the sneezing is something one of the professors in the department, Professor Lydia Baruba, studies the mechanics really of disease spreading in the context of infrastructure in urban settings. And so she's particularly dealing with this question of what if you put more and more people in small environments in a city. So there's interesting challenges here. How do we understand how spreading of disease can be prevented? And so there's multiple challenges. So this is a really interesting grand challenge question of population growth, anything from providing clean air, clean water, to disease, to access to infrastructure, transportation. So it really drives, as I said, a lot of the work in the department is driven by these challenges.
Are there any antibacterial building materials?
Yeah, could be. It could be an option. Except that sort of in the realm of ecological systems, we learn now that microbial colonies actually are oftentimes supporting infrastructures for other living systems. So we've all heard about the microbiome in the human gut, where essentially there are many more microbes than cells in our bodies, and they support our livelihood, essentially, our ability to live. In a similar ways, sort of microbial colonies around food and plants are critical, and so maybe some are important in the context of cities. So if you actually kill them,
so you have to be careful about what you get rid of.
Exactly. So this is a great example of one of the strategic thrusts in the department. Really, is that we're uniquely positioned to do is we have the ecology, which is really understanding of natural living systems, at the same time as we understand the human-built infrastructure, and the interface between them is sort of the frontier of that is in the microbiological context, where we're beginning to understand that many systems we thought are non-living or not important, or they could be, as I say, we could create antimicrobial surfaces. That might not be the best solution, actually. So we're learning a lot about these things, and in a way, learning enables us to engineer. So without understanding how things work, we might make decisions as engineers that actually have very harmful impacts on sustainability, make things unsustainable. And agriculture is an example where this has happened. But there are many other aspects of civil and environmental engineering where this is really critical.
So Ron in Indiana asks, is it still true that civil engineers are the lowest paid of the engineering specialties? How do you counter that when recruiting students?
It's remained a challenge to some degree. The way we address this is that our department really does not educate traditional civil engineers to that degree. I think we're really looking forward into defining the profession and for new opportunities. So if you're a graduate of the department, you're going to go out and be an innovator, inventor in many of these domains. And so we think outside the box of traditional civil engineers. I think we're competing we would be wrong competing with very traditional civil engineering education that people can get from other schools much better than from MIT. I think we're really a couple of steps ahead, and I think the themes I've outlined today show you where we're heading. I mean, we're looking at really fundamentally, so we turned a couple of pages back really in history in a way. Civil engineering really is sustaining society, providing the fundamental infrastructure for societies for civilizations on this planet.
It's almost civilization engineering.
Exactly. It's right. It's a really, really great way of putting it, Judy. And so that's where we come in as MIT CE, MIT Civil Engineering. And so we look at these very fundamental questions. We talk about public health, cities, infrastructure, water supply, global systems. So we really are different and much more fundamental in what we do. And we think that is critical for our students to go out and become innovators and redefine the profession. And so I think, in a way, our students, when you see where they go, they do work on startups. They do work in innovative energy companies, innovative cement companies. They work in cities. They work in one of our alumni runs the resiliency office in New York City. So that's a great example. This is a civil engineering job that is not traditional, but it's really at the frontier of civilization, one of the largest cities in the world, and making that city resilient. So that's what he does. So that's kind of like where we look into the vision for the future, for what the job's like.
So, okay, I think we're almost out of time. I think we'll take one last question. How's that? Laura in Indiana asks, can you give some more examples of industries, companies, or locations where your students are doing co-ops this year, for instance?
Well, the students usually go really around the globe. Anything from local, we have students going to local engineering firms, doing research here locally in the rivers. We have projects in the Malden River, for example, where some environmental challenges, to working in startups. We have students working in startups and consulting industries, here and abroad. And you mentioned the MISTI program earlier, so many of our students actually go spend time in other countries, be it in Africa, China, Europe. So they're really many different places. You could probably name any place in the world and we would have a student there at some point in time.
I have a hunch that the startup that's next to my apartment building has some MIT students working there.
Yeah.
They were at a dinner I was at recently. So they are everywhere.
Yes, you can't escape here. You can't escape the MIT kids. Well, and especially if you go into the the Kendall Square area these days. our students, so I'll give you an example, I mean, specific companies, some students will work at Facebook or Google. And that's maybe unusual. You might think, well, there's only course 6 students, but actually, of course, Google's really big interest is, one of the big interests is in transportation and infrastructure. So they combine the computer science with providing solutions for transportation. And you go in Google Maps. Facebook, similarly, really the model is built on the idea that you have a virtual reality, but you also have it always coupled to the physical places where the students, where you are as a person and your social environment. So a lot of the environmental and civil engineering kind of topics really relate to those companies. So it's oftentimes the students end up in places where it's surprising, but they're really critical contributors to these corporations.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but on behalf of the Alumni Association, thank you, Markus. This has been a really fun conversation.
Thank you.
And to our viewing audience, thank you for joining us today. Alumni who wish to reach Markus directly to ask any further questions can email him at mbuehler@mit.edu or follow him on Twitter at profbuehlermit. We encourage you to continue discussing these topics on our blog, Slice of MIT, by following the link that will appear on your screen, and on Twitter using hashtag #MITFaculty. You can also view an archive of past faculty forums online by visiting the Learn section on the Alumni Association website. Please join us again soon for another session of the Faculty Forum Online.
Thank you very much, Judy. Thank you for listening.